Detective Mike Rodriguez had been working undercover for the Metropolitan Police Drug Task Force for 3 years. His current assignment required him to maintain a cover identity as a regular resident of Pine Valley Estates, a supposedly upscale, a suburban community that had become a hub for illegal drug distribution. The department had rented him a modest townhouse in the community and provided him with a nondescript black Jeep Wrangler that served as both his personal vehicle and mobile surveillance unit. The Jeep looked ordinary from the outside, but contained sophisticated recording equipment, hidden compartments for surveillance gear, and reinforced components that made it far more than a typical civilian vehicle. Mike had spent months carefully establishing his cover story as a freelance IT consultant. He worked from home explaining his irregular hours and the various people who occasionally visited his residence for what appeared to be business meetings but were actually drug buys he was documenting. Pine Valley Estates was governed by one of the most restrictive homeowners associations in the county, led by a woman named Linda Morrison, who treated her position as HOA president like a military command. Linda was a retired insurance adjuster in her mid-50s who had moved to Pine Valley after her divorce and quickly made it her mission to maintain what she called the highest standards of community living. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that she kept perfectly styled, wore designer clothes even for casual neighborhood walks, and drove a pristine white BMW SUV that she washed twice weekly. Linda had implemented dozens of rules that went far beyond typical HOA regulations. She required advance approval for any exterior modifications, including something as simple as changing a doormat. She mandated that all vehicles parked in driveways meet specific aesthetic standards and be no more than 5 years old. She had established quiet hours that extended from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. and prohibited any outdoor activities during those times. Most controversially, she had instituted a rule that any vehicle parked on community property for more than 72 hours without moving could be towed at the owner's expense. Mike first encountered Linda during his second week in the community. He had been returning from a late-night surveillance operation and was unloading equipment from his Jeep when Linda appeared seemingly from nowhere wearing a bathrobe and slippers, but still perfectly made up, as if she had been expecting to encounter someone. She introduced herself with the kind of aggressive friendliness that immediately put Mike on guard. She explained the community rules in exhaustive detail, handed him a 40-page HOA handbook, and made it clear that she would be keeping a close eye on his compliance with all regulations. Mike played his role perfectly, expressing gratitude for her thoroughness and promising to be a model resident. Over the following months, Mike managed to maintain a cordial relationship with Linda. While gathering crucial intelligence on the drug network operating in Pine Valley, his investigation had revealed that several residents were involved in a sophisticated operation that used the upscale community as a cover for distributing high-end drugs to wealthy clients throughout the metropolitan area. The operation was more complex than initially suspected. The drug network had chosen Pine Valley specifically because its reputation as a safe, exclusive community made it unlikely to attract police attention. Several houses in the neighborhood served as temporary storage locations, with drugs being moved between properties on a rotating schedule to avoid detection. The network dealt primarily in cocaine, MDMA, and high-grade marijuana, serving clients who included professionals from law firms, medical practices, and financial institutions. Mike had identified at least 6 residents who were directly involved in the operation and suspected that several others provided support services or turned a blind eye in exchange for financial compensation. His handler, Detective Captain Patricia Hayes, had been impressed with the quality of intelligence he was gathering, and the department was preparing to make coordinated arrests once they had sufficient evidence to ensure convictions. The investigation had reached a critical phase when Linda Morrison began focusing her attention on Mike's Jeep. She had noticed that the vehicle sometimes remained parked in his driveway for extended periods without moving, and had begun documenting what she perceived as violations of the 72-hour rule. In reality, Mike was often away for days at a time, conducting surveillance from other locations or working cases that required him to maintain his cover by appearing to travel for business. Linda started leaving notes on Mike's windshield citing violations of various HOA rules. The first note complained that his Jeep had accumulated a thin layer of dust which she claimed violated the standards for vehicle appearance. The second note cited the 72-hour parking rule and warned that continued violations could result in towing. The third note demanded that Mike attend the next HOA board meeting to discuss his ongoing violations. Mike tried to handle the situation diplomatically. He attended the board meeting and explained that his work as an IT consultant required frequent travel and that he sometimes had to leave his vehicle parked for extended periods. He offered to provide documentation of his travel schedule and suggested that exceptions could be made for residents whose work required irregular schedules. Linda was unmoved by his explanations. She insisted that rules were rules and that no exceptions could be made without setting a dangerous precedent that would lead to chaos in the community. She pointed out that other residents managed to comply with the parking regulations and suggested that Mike could arrange for friends or family to move his vehicle periodically if he was truly concerned about compliance. The other board members seemed uncomfortable with Linda's rigid stance, but were clearly intimidated by her domineering personality. The vice president, a retired accountant named Robert Chen, tried to suggest that some flexibility might be appropriate, but Linda immediately shut down the discussion by citing the HOA covenants and insisting that selective enforcement would expose the association to legal liability. Mike realized that Linda had made his vehicle a personal crusade and that she would not be deterred by reasonable discussion. He began taking extra precautions to move his Jeep regularly, even when it interfered with his surveillance activities. He also started parking the vehicle in different locations around his property to make it less obvious when it remained stationary for extended periods. Despite his efforts, Linda continued to monitor his vehicle obsessively. She began taking photographs of the Jeep with timestamps to document what she claimed were violations. She started a log that recorded the exact position of the vehicle each day and noted any changes in its location. She even recruited other residents to help monitor the situation by asking them to report any observations about Mike's vehicle or activities. The situation escalated when Linda discovered that Mike had installed a small security camera near his driveway to monitor his property. The camera was barely visible and was positioned to record only his own driveway and the immediate area around his townhouse, but Linda immediately filed a complaint claiming that the camera violated privacy rules and could potentially record other residents without their consent. Mike had installed the camera as part of his surveillance operation to monitor the activities of suspected drug dealers who lived nearby, but he could not explain
this to Linda
without compromising his cover. Instead, he tried to address her concerns by adjusting the camera's position and providing documentation that it recorded only his own property. Linda was not satisfied with these accommodations. She demanded that the camera be removed entirely and threatened to take legal action if Mike did not comply immediately. She also began spreading rumors among other residents suggesting that Mike was engaged in suspicious activities and might be violating various laws or community standards. The rumors created additional problems for Mike's investigation. Several residents who had previously been cooperative sources of information became distant and suspicious. Some of the drug dealers he was monitoring began changing their routines, apparently concerned that increased scrutiny in the neighborhood might compromise their operations. Mike consulted with his handler about the situation, and they decided that he should remove the camera to avoid attracting more attention. Captain Hayes was concerned that Linda's obsessive behavior might compromise the entire investigation if she continued to escalate her campaign against Mike. Removing the camera required Mike to adjust his surveillance methods, but he continued gathering intelligence through other means. He had developed relationships with several residents who were not involved in the drug operation and who provided valuable information about unusual activities in the neighborhood. He also maintained visual surveillance from his townhouse and continued documenting the movements of suspected dealers. Linda interpreted Mike's compliance with her camera demands as a sign of weakness and began pushing for additional restrictions on his activities. She proposed new HOA rules that would require residents to provide advance notice of any visitors and would prohibit vehicles from remaining parked for more than 48 hours without moving. The proposed rules were clearly targeted at Mike, but Linda presented them as necessary measures to maintain community security and property values. She argued that unknown visitors and abandoned vehicles created safety risks and made made the neighborhood less attractive to potential buyers. Several residents expressed concerns about the proposed rules during the next HOA meeting. They pointed out that the restrictions would be difficult to enforce and might interfere with legitimate activities such as having family members visit for extended periods or going on vacation without arranging vehicle transportation. Linda dismissed these concerns by insisting that responsible residents would have no difficulty complying with reasonable regulations. She suggested that anyone who objected to the rules might have something to hide, and implied that the community would be better off without residents who could not follow basic guidelines. Mike realized that Linda was becoming increasingly irrational in her pursuit of control over the community. Her behavior was drawing attention from other residents and creating exactly the kind of neighborhood tension that could interfere with his investigation. He began developing contingency plans in case Linda's actions made it impossible to maintain his cover. The situation reached a breaking point during Mike's 4th month in the community. He had been conducting an intensive surveillance operation that required him to be away from his townhouse for 5 consecutive days while monitoring a suspected drug shipment from a location across town. The operation was successful and resulted in the arrest of 2 major suppliers, but it meant that his Jeep remained parked in his driveway without moving for longer than the 72-hour limit Linda had established. When Mike returned to Pine Valley, he discovered that Linda had taken matters into her own hands. She had contacted a towing company and arranged to have his Jeep removed from the property citing HOA violations and claiming authority as the association president to enforce parking regulations. Mike arrived home. Just as the tow truck was positioning itself to remove his vehicle, he immediately intervened, explaining that he had returned from a business trip and requesting that the towing be canceled. The tow truck driver seemed willing to accommodate the request, but Linda appeared on the scene and insisted that the violation had already occurred and that the vehicle must be removed according to HOA rules. The confrontation quickly escalated as Linda became increasingly aggressive in her demands. She accused Mike of deliberately violating community rules and suggested that his behavior was part of a pattern of disrespect for his neighbors and the community standards. She threatened to take legal action if the towing company did not complete the removal immediately. Mike tried to remain calm and professional while protecting his cover identity. He offered to pay any fines associated with the violation and requested an opportunity to discuss the situation with the HOA board before any drastic action was taken. He pointed out that permanent residents should be given reasonable consideration for legitimate absences and that immediate towing seemed disproportionate to the alleged violation. Linda refused to consider any compromise. She had brought a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters and announced that she intended to remove the chain and lock that Mike had used to secure his Jeep to a post in his driveway. She claimed that the chain itself constituted a violation of community aesthetic standards and that she had authority to remove any unauthorized attachments to community property. Mike watched in amazement as Linda began cutting through the chain with the bolt cutters. The lock and chain were not just ordinary security devices, they were specialized equipment provided by the police department and contained hidden GPS tracking devices and other surveillance technology. By removing them, Linda was tampering with official police equipment without realizing the serious legal implications of her actions. The tow truck driver seemed uncomfortable with the escalating situation and asked Linda to provide documentation of her authority to authorize the towing. Linda produced a copy of the HOA covenants and pointed to language that she claimed gave the association broad powers to enforce parking regulations and remove violations. Mike realized that he needed to end the confrontation before Linda discovered the sophisticated equipment hidden in his Jeep or caused damage that would compromise his investigation. He decided to allow the towing to proceed while documenting Linda's actions and preparing to address the situation through official channels. As the tow truck prepared to remove the Jeep, Linda made a critical error that would soon change everything. In her eagerness to assert her authority, she began searching through papers and materials that Mike had left in the vehicle, attempting to find additional evidence of what she perceived as his suspicious activities. Among the papers Linda found was a business card that Mike had accidentally left in the console area. The card identified him as Detective Michael Rodriguez of the Metropolitan Police Drug Task Force and included official contact information. Linda initially assumed it was fake identification that Mike was using for some kind of illegal activity, and she immediately called the police to report what she believed was criminal impersonation of a law enforcement officer. The call was routed to the police department's main dispatch center, where the operator recognized Mike's name and immediately contacted Captain Hayes. Within minutes, Captain Hayes was on the phone with Linda, trying to understand what had happened without compromising Mike's cover or the ongoing investigation. Linda explained that she had discovered what appeared to be fake police identification in the possession of a resident who had been violating HOA rules and engaging in suspicious activities. She demanded that police respond immediately to investigate what she was certain was criminal behavior. Captain Hayes realized that the situation required immediate intervention to protect both Mike's safety and the integrity of the investigation. She dispatched 2 patrol units to Pine Valley with instructions to secure the scene and prevent Linda from taking any further actions that might compromise the operation. The patrol officers arrived at Pine Valley to find Linda standing beside the tow truck holding Mike's police identification and demanding that Mike be arrested for impersonation. The tow truck driver had become increasingly nervous about the situation and was asking to be released from the contract without completing the towing. One of the responding officers, Sergeant David Kim, immediately recognized the complexity of the situation. He quietly confirmed Mike's identity through radio contact with headquarters, while his partner, Officer Lisa Martinez, began documenting the scene and interviewing witnesses. Linda was initially triumphant, believing that her suspicions about Mike had been vindicated and that she would be praised for uncovering criminal activity in her community. She provided the officers with detailed accounts of Mike's various rule violations and presented the documentation she had compiled over the previous months. Sergeant Kim allowed Linda to complete her statement before explaining that the identification she had found was legitimate and that Mike was indeed a police officer working on an authorized investigation. He informed Linda that by tampering with Mike's vehicle and removing police equipment, she had potentially interfered with an ongoing law enforcement operation. Linda's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She refused to believe that Mike was actually a police officer and insisted that the responding officers were either mistaken or complicit in some kind of elaborate fraud. She demanded to speak with higher-ranking officials and threatened to contact the mayor's office if her concerns were not taken seriously. Officer Martinez patiently explained that Mike's credentials had been verified through official channels, and that his presence in Pine Valley was part of a legitimate police investigation. She warned Linda that any further interference with the investigation could result in criminal charges and advised her to cease all monitoring and documentation of Mike's activities. Linda became increasingly agitated as she realized that her months of surveillance and rule enforcement had been directed against an undercover police officer. She began demanding explanations for why she had not been informed of Mike's identity and why the police department had allowed her to unknowingly interfere with an investigation. Sergeant Kim explained that the success of undercover operations depended on maintaining the officer's cover identity and that informing community residents would have compromised the investigation and potentially endangered Mike's safety. He pointed out that Linda's aggressive surveillance of Mike had actually created security risks that could have had serious consequences. The tow truck driver took advantage of the confusion to disconnect his equipment from Mike's Jeep and leave the scene without completing the towing. He had no desire to become further involved in what was clearly a complex situation involving police operations and community politics. Mike remained in character throughout the confrontation, allowing the responding officers to handle the situation while he continued to protect his cover identity. He appeared as surprised as any civilian would be to discover that his vehicle had been targeted for towing, and cooperated fully with the officers' investigation. Captain Hayes arrived at the scene 30 minutes after the initial patrol response. She was a 20-year veteran of the police department with extensive experience in undercover operations and community relations. Her immediate priority was to assess whether Mike's cover had been compromised and whether the investigation could continue. Linda immediately confronted Captain Hayes, demanding explanations for what she perceived as police deception and community infiltration. She insisted that residents had a right to know when law enforcement officers were living in their neighborhood, and argued that the police department had violated the community's trust. Captain Hayes listened patiently to Linda's complaints before explaining the legal framework that governed undercover police operations. She pointed out that law enforcement agencies had broad authority to conduct investigations using covert methods, and that residents were not entitled to be informed of such operations. Linda was not satisfied with these explanations. She began threatening legal action against the police department and demanded compensation for the time and effort she had spent monitoring Mike's activities. She also insisted that the HOA had authority over all residents regardless of their employment, and that police officers were not exempt from community rules. Captain Hayes explained that while police officers were generally subject to the same laws and regulations as other citizens, Mike's undercover assignment created special circumstances that might require flexibility in applying HOA rules. She suggested that Linda contact the police department's legal counsel if she had concerns about the relationship between law enforcement activities and community regulations. The confrontation continued for more than an hour as Linda refused to accept that her actions had been inappropriate. She maintained that she had been protecting the community and following established procedures for enforcing HOA rules. She showed no understanding of how her obsessive and nefarious surveillance had potentially compromised a criminal investigation. Other residents began gathering to observe the unusual scene of multiple police vehicles parked in their normally quiet neighborhood. Some expressed concern about criminal activity in the community, while others seemed curious about the identity and purpose of the undercover officer who had been living among them. Captain Hayes realized that Mike's cover was now completely blown, and that the investigation would need to be restructured or relocated. The presence of multiple patrol units and the extended confrontation with Linda had drawn exactly the kind of attention that undercover operations were designed to avoid. Mike was instructed to maintain his role as a confused resident, while Captain Hayes and the other officers developed a plan for protecting the integrity of the broader investigation. The drug network they were targeting operated across multiple communities, and losing the Pine Valley operation would not necessarily compromise the entire case. Linda continued to argue with the officers, even as it became clear that her position was legally and practically untenable. She seemed unable to accept that her interpretation of HOA authority was incorrect, and that her actions had created serious problems for legitimate law enforcement activities. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of several other HOA board members who had been contacted by concerned residents. Vice President Robert Chen appeared genuinely shocked to learn that Linda had been conducting such intensive surveillance of a community resident and expressed concern about the potential legal liability her actions might have created for the association. Board member Patricia Williams questioned whether Linda had exceeded her authority as HOA president and suggested that the board needed to review their policies regarding enforcement of community rules. She pointed out that Linda's aggressive approach had created exactly the kind of controversy and negative publicity that HOAs typically tried to avoid. Linda became defensive when questioned by her fellow board members, insisting that she had been protecting the community's interests and following established procedures. She accused the other board members of being weak and suggested that their criticism was motivated by fear rather than principled disagreement with her methods. A growing crowd of residents and the extended presence of police vehicles was beginning to attract attention from local news media. Captain Hayes realized that the situation needed to be resolved quickly before it became a public relations problem for the police department. She made the decision to conclude Mike's undercover assignment in Pine Valley immediately and relocate him to another community where he could continue the investigation without the complications created by Linda's interference. The months of intelligence gathering in Pine Valley had provided valuable information that could be used to support operations in other locations. Mike was instructed to pack his essential belongings and prepare to leave the community within 24 hours. His townhouse would be maintained by the police department for several weeks to avoid creating additional suspicion about his sudden departure. Linda seemed to view Mike's departure as a victory that validated her months of surveillance and rule enforcement. She began telling other residents that her diligent monitoring had uncovered suspicious activity and led to official police intervention. The other residents' reactions were mixed. Some expressed concern that they had been unknowingly living near an undercover police operation, while others seemed impressed that their community had been considered important enough to warrant such attention from law enforcement. Several residents approached Mike privately to express support for his work and to apologize for Linda's behavior. They explained that Linda's aggressive enforcement of HOA rules had been a source of ongoing tension in the community, and that many residents were frustrated with her authoritarian approach to community governance. The revelations about Mike's identity also cast new light on Linda's behavior over the previous months. Residents who had observed her intensive surveillance began questioning whether her actions had been motivated by legitimate community concerns or personal obsession with control and authority. Board member Robert Chen called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the implications of Linda's actions and to consider whether changes were needed in the association's enforcement procedures. Several residents expressed concern that Linda's behavior might expose the HOA to legal liability. If similar situations arose in the future, Linda remained defiant throughout the emergency meeting, insisting she had acted appropriately within her authority as HOA president. She argued that the presence of an undercover police officer in the community vindicated her concerns about suspicious activity and proved that her surveillance methods were effective. The other board members disagreed with Linda's assessment of the situation. They pointed out that her actions had potentially interfered with a legitimate police investigation and had created unnecessary controversy in the community. They suggested that more measured approaches to rule enforcement might have avoided the entire confrontation. Patricia Williams proposed new procedures that would require HOA board approval before taking any enforcement actions that might significantly impact residents. She argued that individual board members should not have unilateral authority to make decisions that could affect the entire community's reputation and legal standing. Linda opposed any restrictions on her enforcement authority, arguing that effective community management required decisive action and that consulting with other board members would create delays that would undermine rule compliance. She suggested that the other board members were too lenient and lacked the commitment necessary to maintain community standards. The meeting continued for several hours as residents expressed their opinions about Linda's leadership and the appropriate role of HOA enforcement. Many residents supported more flexible approaches to rule enforcement, while others agreed with Linda that strict compliance was necessary to maintain property values and community quality. Mike completed his departure from Pine Valley without further incident. His sudden relocation was explained to neighbors as a work-related move that required immediate attention. Several residents expressed regret that he was leaving and wished him success in his consulting business. Captain Hayes conducted a thorough review of the Pine Valley operation to identify lessons learned and to assess the impact of Linda's interference on the broader investigation. The intelligence gathered during Mike's assignment proved valuable in subsequent operations and contributed to several successful prosecutions. The drug network operating in Pine Valley was eventually disrupted through operations conducted from other locations. Several major arrests were made, and significant quantities of drugs were seized, though the dealers operating in Pine Valley itself had time to relocate their activities. Before law enforcement could take action, Linda continued serving as HOA president, but faced increased scrutiny from residents and fellow board members. Her handling of the Mike situation became a focal point for ongoing discussions about the appropriate limits of HOA authority and the need for more collaborative approaches to community governance. Several residents who had previously been intimidated by Linda's aggressive enforcement style began challenging her decisions more openly. They questioned the necessity of some of the more restrictive rules she had implemented and proposed modifications that would provide greater flexibility for residents facing unusual circumstances. The Pine Valley HOA eventually adopted new procedures that required board consultation before taking major enforcement actions, and established an appeals process for residents who believed they had been unfairly targeted by rule violations. These changes were implemented over Linda's strong objections but received broad support from the community. Mike's experience in Pine Valley became a case study used in police training programs to illustrate the challenges of maintaining cover identities in communities with aggressive homeowners associations. The incident highlighted the need for better coordination between undercover operations and community relations to avoid similar problems in future investigations. Captain Hayes implemented new protocols requiring undercover officers to receive briefings about local HOA rules and community dynamics before beginning assignments in residential neighborhoods. These briefings would help officers anticipate potential conflicts and develop strategies for maintaining their cover while complying with legitimate community regulations. Linda never fully accepted that her actions had been inappropriate or counterproductive. She continued to believe that her surveillance of Mike had been justified and that the police department should have informed her of his identity from the beginning. She maintained that community leaders had a responsibility to monitor unusual activities and report suspicious behavior to authorities. The incident created lasting changes in the Pine Valley community's approach to governance and rule enforcement. Residents became more engaged in HOA decisions and more willing to challenge policies they viewed as excessive or unfairly implemented. The experience demonstrated the importance of balancing community standards with respect for residents' privacy and legitimate activities. Mike successfully completed his undercover assignment in a different community where his cover remained intact. And where HOA enforcement was less aggressive, the intelligence he gathered contributed to a major operation that resulted in dozens of arrests and the dismantling of a significant drug distribution network. The Pine Valley case became a reminder that even routine law enforcement activities could be complicated by community politics and individual personalities. It illustrated the need for flexibility and discretion in both police operations and community governance to avoid conflicts that served no one's legitimate interests. Linda Morrison's zealous enforcement of HOA rules ultimately backfired by interfering with legitimate police work and creating controversy that damaged the community's reputation. Her inability to distinguish between appropriate oversight and obsessive control led to consequences that extended far beyond the original parking violation she had been attempting to address. The story of the Pine Valley HOA conflict served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining perspective in community leadership roles. It demonstrated that good intentions without wisdom and flexibility could create more problems than they solved. Years later, Mike Rodriguez would look back on his Pine Valley assignment as one of the most challenging and educational experiences of his undercover career. The incident taught him valuable lessons about community dynamics and the unexpected ways that civilian conflicts could impact law enforcement operations. Linda Morrison's legacy in Pine Valley was forever linked to her confrontation with the undercover police officer whose identity she had unwittingly exposed. The incident became a defining moment that changed how the community approached governance and highlighted the complex relationship between individual authority and collective responsibility. The case remained a topic of discussion in both law enforcement and homeowners association circles as an example of how personality conflicts and rigid rule interpretation could escalate into significant problems with far-reaching consequences. It served as a reminder that effective leadership required not just authority, but also judgment, wisdom, and the ability to distinguish between important principles and minor preferences. The transformation of Pine Valley from Linda's authoritarian control to a more collaborative governance model demonstrated that communities could learn from difficult experiences and emerge stronger and more unified. The residents, who had been divided by Linda's enforcement style, found common ground in their desire for more balanced and reasonable community leadership. Mike's successful completion of his law enforcement career included many challenging assignments, but the Pine Valley case remained unique for its combination of criminal investigation and suburban community politics. The experience broadened his understanding of the complex social dynamics that could affect police work in unexpected ways. The Pine Valley, HOA, eventually developed a reputation as a model community that balanced reasonable standards with respect for residents' individual circumstances. The changes implemented after Linda's confrontation with Mike created a framework for governance that other associations studied and emulated. Linda Morrison's story became a cautionary example of how personal obsessions and rigid thinking could transform community leadership roles into sources of conflict and controversy. Her inability to adapt her approach or acknowledge the limitations of her authority ultimately undermined the very community standards she had claimed to protect. The legacy of the Pine Valley incident extended beyond the immediate participants to influence how law enforcement agencies planned undercover operations and how homeowners associations approached rule enforcement. The case demonstrated the importance of communication, flexibility, and mutual respect in maintaining both public safety and community harmony. The conclusion of Mike's Pine Valley assignment marked not an ending but a transformation that affected everyone involved. The community learned valuable lessons about governance and leadership, while law enforcement gained insights into the challenges of operating in highly regulated residential environments. The story of HOA President Linda Morrison and Detective Mike Rodriguez became more than just an account of a parking dispute gone wrong. It evolved into a comprehensive examination of authority, responsibility, and the consequences that follow when rigid interpretation of rules collides with the complex realities of community life and public safety. In the end, the Pine Valley case served as a powerful reminder that effective leadership in any context requires it's not just the authority to enforce rules, but the wisdom to know when flexibility serves the greater good. Linda's failure to grasp this fundamental principle led to consequences that extended far beyond her original concerns about parking violations and community standards. The transformation of Pine Valley from a community dominated by one person's interpretation of proper governance to a more collaborative and inclusive approach demonstrated that positive change was possible even after significant conflicts and misunderstandings. The residents' willingness to learn from the experience and implement meaningful reforms created a stronger foundation for future community leadership. Mike Rodriguez continued his law enforcement career with enhanced appreciation for the complex social dynamics that could affect police operations in civilian communities. His experience in Pine Valley provided insights that proved valuable in subsequent assignments and contributed to improved training programs for undercover officers. The Valley case ultimately illustrated that the most important lessons often emerge from the most challenging and unexpected situations. The collision between Linda's rigid rule enforcement and Mike's undercover police work created a perfect storm that forced everyone involved to examine their assumptions and adapt their approaches to better serve their legitimate goals and responsibilities.